Hi, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and welcome to Chasing Legends. Welcome back to Chasing Legends. Wayne Tuttle, once again your host. Please hit the subscription button, hit the notification bell, go to the About section. Most of all, check out our website at Legend of the Superstition Mountains, oneword.com. You can find all our information there. The bark notes have been uploaded into the archive section, and there's a lot of archival footage we'll be continuing to process through there. That being done, the caveat this week, and I talked about this on our live sessions on Friday, is we're going to go down through a few rabbit holes. It is Chasing Legends, and sometimes you have the urban myth legends and stuff that people ask a lot of questions about, especially during the lives. I get them in person, sometimes even in interviews. And I generally always say it's just kind of like an urban myth. I've kind of caught up bits and pieces of certain things in books or articles, but where do they come from? So I wanted to go to some of these things associated with the Superstition Mountains, some stories or mythology that don't really seem to have names or any point or anything to them, and research and look back into them and kind of find out where they kind of came through or where some of the other information might have sourced out of. So they're going to be different. It's not necessarily part of my fundamental belief in the mountains, or I feel these are necessarily true stories, but they're interesting and they have interesting tangents to them. So this week we'll begin with the story of Steve Brodie. Now we're in the mid 1940s, in fact it's 1944, and a gentleman named John J. Robinson, who was a writer and an author, I believe he wrote a number of books on the Templars and the Masons, and he wrote a number of magazine articles and stuff. And he lived in an apartment building in New York. And one of his neighbors in this building is a gentleman named Steve Brodie. Now, Robinson tells this story, I believe, around 1957. It's the Long John Noble radio show, which was a hugely popular New York City radio show, millions of viewers. And he went in and did an interview about this and talked about this story for the first time. He also, I believe, did a few interviews and talked about the story. So we have some information. There is information out there. Sometimes it's contrasting. I went with John J. Robinson's, mainly the source material I could find on this. So Robinson says he's living in this apartment building in New York City, and there's a gentleman that lives in the building named Steve Brodie. And Brodie's kind of one of those very quiet, keeps to himself, a little nervous energy. But they, over time, talk here and there, and they become friends, and they sit down and talk a lot and all. He said Brodie was an artist, a painter. He painted generally kind of middle-of-the-road type of paintings and artwork and stuff, but he also did jewelry. And Robinson said he could speak for that Brodie, that he did do jewelry because he gifted his wife, I think, like a cloak brooch or something that he'd made, handmade, and Robinson had a type pin. So one day they're sitting in the apartment, Robinson's apartment. They were talking, and I guess Brodie looks over and sees a magazine and asks something about it. It's like, what's that magazine? Now, I believe it was one of Palmer's magazines, either like Amazing Stories or Fate magazine or something. He saw something on it, and Robinson went, oh. And he said he'd picked it up because of a story in there a man named Shavers talked about, of an underground race that lived underground in the earth and all this. And he said Brodie just suddenly said the Darrows. He's speaking of the Darrows, and kind of like got all nervous and everything. And he thought it was very odd because this is not completely out of character for Brodie. And he was, where do you know this from? How do you know, this guy's talking about Darrows? Because he's like, this guy has no interest in this type of material. We've never discussed anything like this. And Brodie says, well, I don't want to really talk about it. And they're friends, so he kind of kind of says, well, I just want to know why you know this terminology. And Brodie's like, I don't want to say it because it makes me sound crazy. You have to promise me you'll never talk to anyone about it, never tell anyone about it. So it never leaves this room. So that's one caveat. Two, I'll tell you what I'm going to say, but I'm going to leave stuff out, and I'll always leave it out because I don't want anyone to ever kind of go to this place or any of this or anything like this to ever happen to someone else. And Robinson agreed to points. He was able to figure a number of things out. Of course, we don't have an exact word-for-word interview or transcription. And Robinson kind of makes he kind of guesses at a lot of what it is. So I'm sure there was stuff that Brodie said that he was able to figure out. The story starts in 1938. And Brodie and another gentleman, whose name was never used, were both making jewelry, and there were particular stones. Now, Robinson says stones, but also sometimes he talks about quartz or quartz crystals. But he talks about certain kind of pieces of quartz or something similar, stones that are only found in certain areas. And they found one area where it would be quite abundant, more easily found, and so forth. And they decided to take a train to this place, and there's a small town outside this place they were going to take a train to. Robinson said from what Brodie never told him the place or the name or anywhere he was. He believed he was in Arizona. He said he was pretty sure Arizona. Brodie said they traveled by train. They got there, and they start getting their supplies and stuff together. They're going to go out and spend a day or two up there in the mountains nearby looking for this stuff. And they ask around, hey, we're looking for this. This is exactly, do you know good spots? And they're told of this area, but they're told don't go up there because people go missing there. People go out there and then they don't come back. People from town have it, went missing and so forth. There's this little bit of urban mythology folklore about it. And Brodie and his partner just kind of laugh it off and like, we'll be fine. Don't worry about us. We'll be all right. And they figure it's just small town superstition. They pack up. They head out to this area. They climb up the mountain. I guess it took them good part of the morning and all, and they get to the spot, and then they climb, they get up, and they kind of a short distance from each other as they're exploring the area looking for this mineral. Brodie says they're searching, and then he hears his partner kind of make an exclamation of some sort. And it's not like, aha, I found it. It was more like, holy, what the crap, So he says something, so Brodie looks up, and there's someone standing in front of his partner. A short distance in front of him. And it's a person like he calls it a cowl, a robe or a cowl, dark, couldn't see the face. And he said he was just standing there perplexed, like, where'd this guy come from? Who is this guy? What the hell's going on here? So they're standing there, and his partner gets all very nervous and starts to back away and starts to run up, kind of turn to go one direction. And then another person shows up there, similarly dressed. Then his partner decides to run off the other direction, and another person similarly dressed shows there. Now, Brodie said he was absolutely transfixed. He doesn't know if he was just nervous, shocked, didn't know what to do, what to say. And then the first figure raised a stick, and he called it a stick. He didn't call it a wand or anything, he doesn't suggest how it was pointed, but he said there was a stick, and he raised the stick, and he said it was like electricity or something. Electricity came from this stick. And he didn't give a great description. Robinson never did. And from the stick, it hits, and his partner suddenly starts screaming and blood-curdling screams, and then he suddenly loses sight of him. He falls down. Brodie said the one distinct thing he remembers, because he never could really hear his partner again after that moment, was the smell of like burning flesh. And he said it particularly took him to this point. I guess Robinson even said if they went out to eat, Brodie could not eat meat, cooked meat at all. It was like the smell of cooked meat just completely turned his stomach. So Brodie said this happens, and he's stuck. He wants to go, he wants to leave, and then he's realizing in his head, even if I can move, does it really matter? And then he said one of these same figures, he didn't see where the other figures were, but one just appears in front of him. And he said it almost came out of the ground. He said it literally, there was nothing there, and then it just moved up in front of me. He said the figure reaches out towards him, and he can't move. He's completely mesmerized. And the figure has what looks like two 50-cent pieces, silver dollars, and they were on like wires. And he reached out and put one behind each ear on Brodie. And Brodie said, that's the last thing I remember at that moment. It just went darkness. Brodie awakes, and he says then for a number of times, 3 or 4 times, he wakes and he would call it a dungeon, a cavern, a cave, an old mine. It was someplace. He felt like he was underground, but he would wake up and start to pull his consciousness together and look around and kind of see where he was, and he'd see few of these cloaked figures around, but he'd see other people, and they were just normal other people, like walking around and wandering around. And he was always just kind of like he was doing something, and he just woke up, and he would look around. He said one time he managed to speak to someone, and there was a woman nearby him, and he asked her, and she told him, the Darrows have captured you. You're now a slave to the Darrows. And she said, you'll be here. There's no escape. There's nothing you can do. Don't even try and think to escape, because you'll never get anywhere, never get very far. And it terrified him, but he said each time he would kind of start to get to where he was almost conscious enough to kind of get self-control, one of these robed figures would hold up one of these sticks, and then just suddenly he would black out again. He didn't say anything about the electricity or anything like that. He just said they would like raise this stick or rod in the air, and then he'd be out. So he said that had happened 3 or 4 times. He kind of came to consciousness, and then just suddenly one day he's walking down Broadway in New York towards Times Square. And he said, it was just like I'd been walking, and then I just suddenly was conscious that I was there walking. And he said it completely threw him off, because he was trying to figure out how he got there. Now, he was just kind of like completely like looking around, trying to figure out, why am I in New York? I'm pretty sure I was in Arizona. He's kind of having this little dreamlike memory of everything. And he's looking around going, well, what's going on? As he's walking, he looks into the windows of the buildings he's passing, and he sees he has a beard, and his hair's grown out quite long. And he's looking at himself and thinking, what the... So he's not quite sure what's going on. He's checking himself. He's wearing the same clothes he had in Arizona. He said, it's the same identical clothes I'd been wearing in Arizona. He said, I checked my pockets, and everything I had was in my pockets, including the money when we bought supplies. He said, I had just about $100 left, and the exact change, I had that in my pocket still. So he said he's thoroughly confused, because it seems to be telling him he was in Arizona and all this, but somehow he's ended up in New York. Now, at this time, Robinson's wanting to question him a little, like curious, like, are you making that? And he said, but Brodie seemed absolutely 100% like, no, this is exactly what happened. I have no idea. Brodie said he went to a barber shop to get cleaned up, and kind of as the cobwebs are clearing, and he's remembering more and more of kind of what happened, of what he could remember. And he said it was there he saw a newspaper and realized it had been 2 years since he'd been in Arizona. So 2 years had gone by, just about 2 years, and he shows up in New York. At this point, Brodie wore his hair a little long, but he took his hair and he pushed it back and showed Robinson where he had these 2 marks behind his ear. And they were about the size of a silver dollar, and they're perfectly circular. No hair would grow in that area right behind the ear, and they were kind of a little bit indent impressions. And he said, this is the mark, I guess, of the Darrows that they leave upon people that they've come in contact with. Robinson's kind of like not sure what to think, but they sit around and they talk a number of times about this, and Brodie just won't tell him. He says, I'm not going to tell you where it was or anyone. He says, I don't want anyone to ever go through that, because if something would happen to you, you're married, I know you and your wife, I don't want something to happen to you, we're friends. He said, it's just, and he's almost sorry he ever said anything. Well, shortly after that, Robinson gets another job, and he's going to move and leave the apartment building. So he moves away, and he's gone for a good period of time, 6 months to a year, and then he returns, and he's in town doing business in New York, and he goes back by the apartment building, and he's figuring there's 2 individuals. I think one gentleman's name was Poppy Egan, an older man that lived there he was friends with, and Steve Brodie was another person he wanted to see how Steve was doing. So he went by, found out Poppy Egan had passed away, and he talked to some of the other residents that were still there, and they said, no, shortly after you left, they said it wasn't a month or so after that, Steve just quietly got his stuff together and moved away. And they said, nothing unusual, nothing odd. They said he just seemed to get his stuff together and move. Now, Robinson got the feeling that Brodie thought the Darrows could hear him or could follow him or knew what was aware, could see through, and were aware that he spoke to Robinson, and he was quite nervous about that someone was looking or listening or following him. So Robinson talks to a number of people. Nobody knows what happens to Brodie. They just know he left. He's walking out, and he sees one other longtime resident just returned, and he's getting ready to go up, and they start talking about, hey, how's it been going? You know, how are you doing? How's the family? How you been doing? And then he mentions, hey, you know, I heard about Pop Egan. It's a complete shame. He passed away. That's really kind of rough at all. And this individual says, by the way, I just did a trip to California not too long ago, business trip. He said, the strangest thing happens. Remember that kind of odd guy, the very quiet, kind of nervous guy, Steve Brodie? And he's like, yeah. Steve and I were good friends. He says, well, I was on a train from California. We're going through Arizona. And he says, I'm walking down to use the restroom. And he says, I look over, and there's Steve looking out the window. And I go over and look at him, and I realize, Steve, hadn't seen him for a long time. He says, we had been neighbors. He said, we didn't know each other that well, but we knew each other. We'd had talks and conversations in the building and stuff. So he said, I went over to talk to him and say, hey, Steve, it's me, you know. And he said he never moved. He said he just kept looking out the window like a zombie. He says, very weird. He said, I even put my hand on his shoulder and kind of kept nudging him like, hey, Steve, it's me. You know, and he said he never turned, never blinked an eye, never changed his breath, nothing. It was like nothing was there. Found it particularly weird, but he just said, I'm going to continue to the restroom, and when I'm done, I'll come back, and then I'm going to sit down, because there was an open seat. I'll sit down and sit there and continue to try to talk to Steve. Said when he went to the restroom, he had to wait, use the restroom, come out. During that time, there was a small town on the railway they stopped in, and he said Steve must have got off there, because when I returned out, Steve's not in the seat. He said I went up and down the train, looked, and he was nowhere in sight, so he must have got off. Now, whether it was me interfering with him or that's where Steve was deciding to leave, so be it. Now, Robinson doesn't say in any articles, interviews, anything I could find, what the name of the town was. I had a suspicion that they were implicating one possibility is Superior. And one of the reasons I picked up Superior is it's on the railroad. If you're coming from Los Angeles, you come through Phoenix, and a small town you would stop. I don't know if there was a train depot in the junction, but Superior there would be. Also in the area, there are pieces of obsidian globule known as Apache tears found very, very frequently around what we call Apache Leap by Superior. And I thought that could have been the stone that he was looking for, because those were quite, especially when I was a kid in the 60s and 70s, it was a big deal going out and getting Apache tears. So if he was new in an area that those were very plentiful and all that, that is an area that you could find those and quite well known. And there's a bit of a history and urban myth and legend with the area. Could have been the Superstitions. I thought Four Peaks, but the train story, I don't know if it quite fits with that. But Robinson said he never heard from anything again, nothing to know. He doesn't know what the whole thing to make believe. And that's the story. And I believe that story because it was in a radio show, given in interviews. I don't know if it ever showed up in any book format. Robinson didn't write any books like with that type of paranormal type discussion, or if any other authors included it. I've never seen it. But I went through grabbing stuff and kind of looking and trying to, and all the stories will have variations, but I tried to stay with the clearest, true one that Robinson based everything on. He talked about, because he said this was a real person. I knew him. I met him. Robinson never seems to go down that pathway again. When he writes books, they're about Freemasonry and the Templars and that type of thing. Very different. But I found it odd that he was from New Jersey, obviously, and the electrode thing in the late 1930s is when they started electroshock therapy and electrode type behavioral changes and stuff. The fact that he was a very creative person, he did painting and stuff, it kind of was odd, because as soon as I started hearing the story, I was wondering, you know, people that have episodes with that type of treatment, especially in the 60s and 70s, but who knows what it was like in the late 30s or early 40s when they first started trying that stuff. And I don't know of anything in particular they'd put behind the ears, but they could have done that for some type of shock therapy. You could see that as possibly he was in New Jersey. He was put in some sort of sanitarium for something or some reason, a breakdown. and that all this creates from that type of thing. So perhaps there is no Daryl's. Now, that is a problem. That did he pick up a magazine and come up with that word or hear of that? Because Robinson doesn't think so. Robinson said he seemed to have zero interest in anything of that type of the paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, nothing like that, except for that one story there he talked about. So was there something wrong with Steve Brodie? Was it a psychological incident and that everything imprinted upon him and he was held and detained and all this stuff, but there's a fantasy story with it, became well adjusted? Or as the story suggests, is there something more sinister to all this? Because he was later seen by a completely person that had nothing to do with any of the stories and had no reason to understand any of it, that he was seen again in Arizona where this supposedly took place. So there's one of those things you can pipe in and say, well, where does that story come from? Where do people get this stuff at all? It's the first one I've heard about any underground kind of group or anything anywhere near the superstitions. And it doesn't at any time ever attach itself to the superstitions. But it does sound, when you read through and you look at it and you start trying to go through, like, okay, something found in quantities here, okay, Apache tears or certain amethyst or certain quartz crystals and stuff. And when you look at everything and try to put the story together, it could be the general area, even superior. And you can see how that story would attach to one to the other. So a very odd story. You can kind of try to look that stuff up. I had no luck finding anything with Steve Brodie or that particular individual, anything. Robinson and whoever, the radio show host, and all these different people, Palmer, the magazine owner, and a lot of these other people involved in the story are very real people, and there's usually Wikipedia pages and stuff determining them. They don't always have anything to do with the Steve Brodie story, but you have enough documentation of very real people surrounding this story. And puzzling still that Robinson never wrote really a book about this or explored it any further. It was kind of like an anecdotal type tale he told about something that happened in his life. But it does pertain, and you can see where it can get grasped upon. So that's the first of number 4 or 5 stories we'll kind of do that are interchangeable with the superstition. Some will actually take place in the Superstition Mountains per the people that reported them. And they'll have different types of documentation. And I'll always look at it to see, is there a possibility this swings? The Steve Brodie one is probably the one story that really kind of makes me sit there and go, for a minute, because of just the travel time and the fact that the end of the story, he's found in Arizona again. So I would chalk it up to electroshock therapy or something like that, or a psychological issue. But the fact that the story seems to emanate from Arizona, and then the last place he's ever seen later is in Arizona after he told the story, is like Robinson's feeling was the Daryl's had a hold of him again and drew him back. And that's where he was trying to escape them, but he got ultimately drawn back and was probably enslaved by the Daryl's. So there you go. Sleep well tonight. Don't travel any place underground or above ground, and don't walk around with hooded people with big sticks, okay? So there you go, the story of Steve, all right? Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know, because I wanted to do some of these to kind of touch those urban myths, because I get a lot of questions about them, and I thought I should take it upon myself to do some research and say, I know okay, I've heard this story enough. Okay, I want to hear what that is. So the Steve Brodie story, you get bits and pieces of it in other stories, I believe, because it was the first one I wanted to lead with, because it took place, according to Steve Brodie, in 1938. So that's why I wanted to lead with it. It's one of the oldest ones I heard of. It actually has enough real people, documented people who were very real people that went on record talking about it. And the fact that Robinson spoke about it in a radio program and wrote some articles concerning it, it makes me think that that's enough documentation. You can move a step forward, a hesitant step, but a step forward. So thanks for joining us in Chasing Legends. Like I said, I really hope everybody enjoyed it. I know that's a particular niche thing for some people, but it's storytelling irregardless, okay? So, that being said and done, again, hit www.legendsuperstitionmountains.com or whatever it is. Get to our website. Check all the stuff there. And it's not necessarily always about the t-shirts and the coffee cups and the hats and that kind of stuff. But check out the archive section, because we wanted to bring everybody the stuff. When we talk about stuff, we wanted to put stuff in there and put things about it. If I had pictures of Steve Brodie and that type of stuff, I'd be putting that stuff up here. Hopefully there'll be a few things we can put with some of the other stories. There is no photographs or anything Robinson had of that stuff. So there you go. So thanks for joining us. I hope everybody has a great week. I hope this is the good kickoff for the rest of your week, and I hope everybody's starting to enjoy the holidays. But until the next time we meet, remember, I'm Wayne Tuttle. You're not. And this was Chasing Legends.